Hello, welcome back to Afterglow. This is episode 49, and today I'll be talking about Mortal Kombat, kind of specifically for the Sega Genesis, but I will branch out a little bit into other versions of Mortal Kombat 1. But the original version I played was on the Sega Genesis. Now, this game at the time was known to be incredibly violent, and it's kind of amazing looking at it today because it was not really that violent. Yeah, there was a little bit of gore, yeah, there were some skeletons here and there, but honestly, it's not nearly as gory as any game that you would play today. Great example, kind of dating us recording a little bit, but RoboCop Rogue City has significantly more gore than Mortal Kombat. But back then, this is one of those games that was actually thrown in front of the government as an excuse to get some regulations going against violence in video games, which I always find that really, really interesting. But that's enough of me rambling for the intro. We're going to take a quick music break, and then I'll talk about my memories of the original Mortal Kombat. Alright, and welcome back. So, my first memories of Mortal Kombat were actually of the arcade version. Years and years ago, I was at Marengo Caves over in Indiana, and they had, I remember, it was outside, but there was like a wooden wall with an overhang over it, and there were a few arcade machines, not very many, I want to say like 2 or 3. But one of those arcade machines was Mortal Kombat. It definitely caught my eye. I had heard of it before, but I hadn't seen it in person until now. And the digitized graphics really caught my eye, along with like how clean they looked for digitized graphics. I was really impressed. Honestly, the actors, with them being digitized, stood out more to me than the violence and the gore and whatnot. But I did watch the Attract mode a little bit. I don't think I played it. But I did watch the Attract mode a couple times before I had to go off and do other things, but it definitely left an impression. And I eventually managed to get a copy for the Sega Genesis. If I remember right, I had swapped a copy of Street Fighter Champion Edition for the Genesis for Mortal Kombat. And one of the things that's ingrained in my mind to this day, ABACABB, which is the blood code. And I can still rattle that off the back of my head. It was just ingrained in there. I remember whenever I got the game from the guy, he's like, writing it down on a piece of paper. He's like, you want this? And it was a fantastic game, in my opinion. The fighting mechanics weren't quite as deep as Street Fighter 2, in my opinion, but it made up for it with the digitized graphics, which looked pretty good in the Sega Genesis. Controversial take, I do think they look a hair bit better on the Super Nintendo, but of course the Super Nintendo didn't have the blood, and it didn't have the fatalities. Well, they had fatalities, but they were highly censored. So, of course, I went with the Sega Genesis version. And I liked how the developers kind of squeezed as much mileage as they could out. First of all, by making the mirror match, which is, hey, we can reuse the same sprite. Of course, they kind of did the same thing with the ninjas. Of course, the classic two ninjas, Scorpion and Sub-Zero. I'm pretty sure this is a game where everyone kind of like chose, are they like a Scorpion guy or a Sub-Zero guy? And I always lean towards Sub-Zero personally, although I know Scorpion is also incredibly popular in his own right. But yeah, I normally played as Sub-Zero. Sometimes I would go with Liu Kang and sometimes Sonya, but those are really my main three, with Sub-Zero definitely being the leader of those three. And I could go through like most of the fights pretty easily. The difficult part for me were the endurance matches where you had to defeat two opponents back to back. Managed to do it, obviously, but that was to me the hardest point of the game. Goro, honestly, was a complete joke of a boss character. Like, I could jump kick him constantly, and there was no real contest. Shang Tsung might have been a bit more difficult, but he still's not as difficult as those endurance matches, in my opinion. But he's fairly easy to take out. He can transform into any fighter, obviously, which is a cool little touch, and is something I feel stands out on the cartridge systems versus the CD systems back in the day. Because on the cartridge system, they might have not had the graphics that the CD-based systems had, but no load time for Shang Tsung whenever he had to transform into another character. Whereas if you played any of the Mortal Kombat games on like the PlayStation, there was definitely like a load time whenever he did a transformation, and it was kind of jarring in a way. Kind of one of the reasons why I prefer the N64 version of Mortal Kombat trilogy. But back to the original Mortal Kombat, I really enjoyed the Genesis version. Of course, had that blood code. I do think eventually I managed to get Street Fighter II Champion Edition back while keeping Mortal Kombat. So I had both fighters. I could like compare and contrast. I still think Street Fighter II is the deeper game. Although Mortal Kombat, you can't deny the fun factor at all. The Genesis version was the only one that I owned as far as any of the Mortal Kombats. I never got 2 or 3. So I played a lot of it, and because I mained a Sub-Zero, memorized his fatalities, all the special moves, so I turned into a beast on Mortal Kombat 1 as Sub-Zero. Down the road, I had actually gotten the arcade 1-up machine that had Mortal Kombat 1, 2, and 3 on it. So I replayed the arcade version, and honestly, it's significantly more difficult than the Genesis version. Either that, or maybe I'm not as good as I used to be. But I do find the Genesis version to be easier than the arcade version. I can still beat the arcade version, but I can only beat it with Sub-Zero. Whereas in the Genesis, I can beat it with every character in the game. But had an absolute blast with it. And to this day, I feel that if you're going to play Mortal Kombat 2 or 3, the Super Nintendo version is better. But if you're going to play Mortal Kombat 1, you got to go with the Sega Genesis version to get the full effect. With the original fatalities, with all the blood in there. Yes, you do have to put in a code, which is slightly annoying, but it's not really that big of a deal. At least you have the option to do it, whereas in the Super Nintendo version, it's almost grosser in a way, because instead of the blood, your people will sweat, and you'll see the sweat flying left and right. So there's like gallons of sweat flying off these guys instead of gallons of blood. It's like, man, it must smell awful. But yeah, absolutely loved the original Sega Genesis version to this day. Again, if you're going to play it today, you probably are going to lean more towards the arcade version. I totally get it. But if you get the chance and you want to see kind of like the roots of the game, the Genesis version was definitely where it was at whenever the home versions came out. I believe there's also a Game Boy version. I don't think it was really that good. I've never played it, though. The Super Nintendo version honestly looked a bit better, but missing content, so I can't recommend it. So if you're going for authenticity, back when this game was originally ported, gotta play that Genesis version. And of course the arcade version, with where it all started. But that's the one thing that a lot of people don't consider these days, is whenever these games get re-released, a lot of times you don't see those home ports. And I'll tell you what, that was a huge time whenever Mortal Kombat came out for home systems, because everyone was just snagging it up left and right. But that's going to close out my memories of the original Mortal Kombat. Like I said, other than the Genesis and the arcade version, I didn't really play a whole lot of other versions, but I do fondly remember my time with it. And it got me into fighting games. That game and Street Fighter 2, they're really the two that got me into fighting games, and I eventually got the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle Tournament Fighters for the Super Nintendo, and I was wowed by that game. Like, it was up there with Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat, in my opinion. Only the Super Nintendo version, though. The NES version and the Sega Genesis versions were trash, but that Super Nintendo version was awesome. But we're going to do some more music, and then we're going to run the outro. This is going to be a shorter episode, but I don't have a lot to say about Mortal Kombat, other than the fact that I really, really enjoyed that Sega version. So, enjoy the music. Welcome back, and thank you once again for taking the time to listen to my retro gaming memories and ramblings. If you check the episode description or the episode info, depending on where you're listening at, you'll find some notes down there, including a Discord server for Afterglow that you can join. There's also a link for a Patreon if you would like to donate $1 a month and get a shout out at the end of every episode. Friends of the show include Retro Gaming Roundup, which is one of the longest running retro video game podcasts. Monthly releases. Every release is between 5 to 8 hours long. Tons of stuff in there. There's a Secret Levels podcast, where they cover one game per episode. Definitely a funny group of guys. They've been having quite a few special guests on here lately. I was actually on one of them, and they've had a gentleman from Retro Pop Relics on there. Can't think of his name right now, and of course I didn't do my homework and look up his name, and so that's on me. But if you want to check out RetroPopRelics.com, they've got some awesome 3D printed oversized game cartridges that look awesome. So free plug to Retro Pop Relics. Also check out the Lost and Gone podcast. He checks out media that maybe never came out, or media that did come out but you don't really think about a lot these days. Links to all those shows will be in the notes. As far as Afterglow, our show logo and our artwork is done by TobyVonDoom from Secret Levels, and the intro and outro music for Afterglow is done by Grim from the Lost and Gone podcast. Thank you once again for taking your time to listen. If you enjoy listening, I would really appreciate it if you have time. Rate the podcast. Even if you don't think it's worth 5 stars, give it an actual rating. Give me some feedback. I would love to hear what you guys think. Until then, though, I look forward to whatever you guys have to say. Thank you for listening, and I hope you're looking out for the next episode of Afterglow.